It seems apt that W.A.G.E is here tonight to bring to light ongoing unjust fiscal practices in the art world as we witness the unfolding saga of Wall Street and what results from unregulated economic greed. For the artists here tonight, I imagine few or none of you make a living wage solely by selling your art. Most successful artists teach and supplement their income in some fashion. And how many of you have exhibited work in institutions and museums in the US in which all costs incurred were covered by the institution? When I say all costs, I'm talking about travel expenses, if any, and all exhibition installation costs covered, and receiving an artist fee for the hours you spent consulting with the institution and preparing works for the exhibition, and a lecture fee if you lectured, and the reproduction fee if you used your images if they used your images in advertising materials. Does this list sound absurd? It's long. What is absurd is to exclude artists from the payment of their labor, to the reproduction and exhibition of their work, within an economic climate where it is socially acknowledged that payment is granted for services rendered. It's not absurd because there are many examples of artist fees being covered in their entirety in many other countries. Possibly you're thinking, well, they must be socialist, or they have more government funding for private institutions, or than our private institutions. These things may be true, and it may explain why they have adopted more humane relationship towards artists than what we experience here, but it's not an excuse for not changing things here. If capitalism is your bag and a priority, I can't think of anything more capitalist than getting paid for your labor, for your copyrights, for institutions to aid in our ongoing contribution to the economy with all the money we spend maintaining our art practice. Let there be transparency. Do not be deceived by the ever-present "we don't have money" excuse. The United States is home to many of the wealthiest institutions in the world. U.S. institutions simply, flat out, refuse to put artist fees in their annual budgets. And why do they refuse? Because they can. As artists, we are apparently a masochistic bunch. We let them get away with it. Apparently, we must suffer for our art. And I think there are plenty of other things in the world to suffer over besides a legitimate desire to be paid for our labors. As artists, we have made an unspoken collective agreement to work in exchange for the ever elusive sugar daddy known as exposure. Today, we make a public and collective statement that we cannot and will not live off exposure in exchange for our labors. For those of us involved in whatever level in the art world, we have watched massive economic expansion over the past decade. The art market is no longer an exclusive, intimate number of uber-wealthy collectors. It's international. It's an expansive web of artists, curators, writers, critics, collectors, art schools, galleries, biennials, art fairs, nonprofit art spaces, museums, institutions, on and on. But I'd like to speak locally for a moment. Given that New York is one of, if not the cultural capital of the world, I feel that making a change here will inevitably affect the larger picture. In New York, the production of art is essential to the economy as a whole, but also the heart and soul of the city. And we will argue here tonight that the well-being and ability of artists to survive in the great city is in crisis. I'd like to quote an article I read recently that was an interview with Susan and Michael Hort. They're two sort of well-known avid collectors of contemporary art in New York. They stated, "We don't find the artists in New York. They're in Europe right now. It's very difficult for a young artist to make a living in New York and do a good job. If they graduate from art school, have a studio and an apartment in New York, you have to have a full-time job, in which case you can't do your art. Or you have to sell in a gallery, in which case you're selling your soul. And your art will never change, because you know if you make your black paintings that you dream of making and they don't sell, you're dead. Art is, if you make money, okay, but it really should be about creating something that's important to civilization and that moves people," end quote. It's one thing when artists complain, but you know there is a serious problem when even the collectors are bitching about economically debilitating circumstances. And why do you think people are flocking to get MFAs? Because it's one of the few options to get a loan, to give you time to develop your work. Artists now don't need an MFA any more than they did 20 years ago. What artists need now, that is harder and harder to come by, is time, valuable time. Unfortunately, it seems that many of those with power, those who operate larger cultural institutions, seem to ignore this fact. The fact that artists do not get paid to go to their studios, that selling art is a possibility but not a promise, that we should not feel required to sell for mere survival, especially when we are laboring in so many other ways. Our labor is more than just the sum of a collectible product. We also should feel our career is dependent on the act of, we should also not feel our career is dependent on the act of giving and donating our time, our money, our work. And in particular, to institutions who ask the public to pay to see our work. We are not fighting to be rich, we are fighting to survive. There is this art market, this seemingly thriving and expanding quicker than you can say art fair art market. But where's the money? In the secondary market? In enormously endowed institutions? It's in many places that thrive off our products and give nothing in return. But what we ask for is quite simple. It's very reasonable. We may not be able to quit our jobs and joyfully produce art 24/7, but we'll feel less abused. Let's look at an inspiring example that exists only hours from here via our Canadian neighbors. In 1968, CARFAC was created and has successfully represented the rights of artists and established a universal fee system based on the size of an institution and the various aspects of exhibition labor that an artist contributes. To quote CARFAC's statement of purpose, we believe that artists, like professionals in other fields, should be paid for their work and share equitably in profits from their work. Doesn't seem too unreasonable. The first CARFAC fee schedule was met with great disbelief and hostility. Some galleries supported it, but for the most part, many refused. As we all know, change never comes easy. As a result, CARFAC announced that its members would boycott non-fee paying institutions. And guess what happened? They started paying fees. People we exist in and play willingly into an exploitive system that other people recognize and began changing 40 years ago. We can all just sit here and bitch about it, but I say, I can't survive any longer. You can't survive any longer. by being complacent. We are here today to begin and gather momentum, to gather you to create a collective agency to provide us with what we need and deserve. W.A.G.E on. Thank you.
What kind of willpower must you have to remain an artist in this city? What kind of crazy determination and resolve? The willpower to live month to month, if not hand to mouth, every week, every day, for years on end, and feel privileged because you are working as an artist in this city. Feel privileged because you are surviving at the bare minimum. You must have the willpower to survive without a real job, any sense of stability or regular income. The willpower to go without health insurance for more years than you can count. The strength and resolve to be an artist and expect no compensation. I get up every day and I go to my studio. Sometimes I work over 40 hours a week if I can, if I didn't manage to find some sort of day job that would pay me, as I'm constantly trying to hustle. But I work my ass off in my studio. But my studio is not an office. My art practice is not a business. We should not be pressured to feel that as artists, we are some sort of venture capitalists by going at it and getting a studio and doing our work and setting it up. We don't get a studio because we expect to make a profit. We're not setting up a store to sell our art. The business model must stop being compared to an artist studio practice. It's ridiculous. I'm an artist and I am not a venture capitalist. Since moving here 8 years ago, I've lived off of less than what an average college grad would make working at a nonprofit. It's barely enough to get by, and I'm sure that's no surprise to most artists, and especially many of you out there. That includes times of exhibiting my work in major institutions. And I don't come from money. I don't have family money like many people in this city. But what have I been paid, apparently? Cultural capital, exposure. That's glamorous. Let me tell you about the glamour of being an artist in this city. The glamour of not being able to eat well. The glamour of not being able to afford to go to the museums in this city. The glamour of not being able to actually make the work you want because you can't afford to make it. The glamour of not being able to go to the doctor. The glamour of not being able to get your teeth cleaned. The glamour of moving every year or two further and further away from the city. The glamour of not having a home. The glamour of being made to feel idiotic when you ask to be paid. The glamour of not being able to get a well-paid part-time job. The glamour of needing surgery that you can't afford. The glamour of having a landlord who won't turn the heat on in the winter. The glamour of sleeping in your coat and hat. Are you feeling me? How glamorous it is to be a city in New York City? To be an artist, I mean. I am my own city, but to be an artist. And the glamour, let's not forget, the glamour of spending your last dollar every month. I feel like a prostitute working as an artist in this city. I really do. And a clown, too, I sometimes say. I have a price, and I need to get by. I'd like to buy some new socks and underwear. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. This is some clean underwear. Something like that. The economy of the art world is upside down. The collectors and galleries fetishize our outsideness and otherness. They like us poor. They enjoy it. It makes them feel cool to be around us. All that edgy, crazy, gay art. They want a picture of it to hang on their wall. They want to keep us on the edge because they stupidly think it makes the work more interesting. It's only more interesting to them because they have no idea what the fuck it means to be an artist. To get up and do your own work, your own way, and have the drive to express yourself. They want us to die poor. That would make their collection more valuable and more interesting, wouldn't it? Maybe it would actually shoot it up. They romanticize our poverty and outsider status from some misinformed idea or opinion that it makes an artist better to suffer. We are not asking the world here at W.A.G.E. We are simply asking to be paid for our labor. Museums and galleries constantly want performance art for free. It's like they need a clown for the opening or something. What do they think? That we dream it up while we're watching TV during the commercials? Performance art is work. That's work. That's days, weeks, or months of years of research and work. And sometimes, if you're lucky and pushy, sometimes you might get $100, $200. If you're really pushy and bitchy, you could maybe get them $300, maybe. That is, especially if you don't have a gallery or an agent maybe to call and be the bitch. Then you are pushy and the curator is annoyed with you because they have had to bristle some fur up in their modernist tower about something that costs less than their budget for toilet paper. And hey, since you weren't easy to work with and you were a pain in the ass for all that back and forth about the money, they don't want to work with you again. And sometimes you're caught turning around wondering why people are paying to get in somewhere to see your work, but you're not even getting a cut at the door. Not even a cut. You need to survive, to make a living, are totally invisible, and it makes you feel crazy. Crazy. And only crazy artists ask for money. Do they think artists are magic? I'm seriously wondering. Is it all part of the je ne sais quoi, isn't it? Cultural capital and exposure. The touch of 1 million eyeballs produces not a penny. Not a penny, folks. I need to do laundry, and those eyeballs don't help. In fact, they like seeing me in the dirty clothes that I have on. They like crazy artists. And what of it, folks, if you don't make an object or objects? Then you don't even have that tiny percentage of a gamble to sell your work. This city and its art institutions are killing its artists. That's right. We can't even survive. The situation is dire. This is a crisis. What do you think the city would be like without artists? We made New York City, New York fucking City. Corporate culture will stagnate your life. Businesses think they can create culture now, but they are wrong, wrong, wrong. We are the ones who make this city vital, interesting, active, engaging, and fun. We are the ones. It's not Wall Street. Kick the bankers out. I've been making honest work my whole life. Kick the fucking bankers out of the city. Artists don't need a bailout plan. We don't need a bailout plan. We need a life plan. Choose life. We want to live. We want to live in this city. We need our city's institutions, public and private, to take artist labor into consideration every time they use it. We need to let them know that what is making their cultural institution rich is the product of months or years of unpaid labor, or days, doesn't matter. What is your day worth? What is your hour worth? What is your time worth? What kind of shitty things do you have to do to make money and still be an artist? How many ways do we have to degrade ourselves? The degradation and exploitation continues right through the doors into the institutions you are supposed to want to have an exhibition at. The only way right now to exist as an artist in this city is to be a slut and let everyone fuck you over. Thank you.
Got some last finishing words. It's hard to follow that, but I'm going to try. Thank you, AJ, for the tip, by the way. I'm going to tell you some true stories, believe it or not. They're going to be true. I'm not making any of this up. Some of you may be artists. If I or you, if we're not speculators in the art market, but rather we are artists, how do we survive in these inspiring, amazing boroughs of New York, one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in? Surprisingly, and you may find this shocking, these statistics I'm going to read, I am forced to pay for rent, food, clothing, art materials, and my installations. In the US, according to US art institutions, I must make the money to pay for these things elsewhere, perhaps at a separate job, or perhaps hit the jackpot in the art market. Because US institutions, US art institutions, will not pay artist fees. This may be clear to you now after our time up here. And only sometimes will they cover expenses. This is because they are providing an allegedly livable, eatable, drinkable product they like to call exposure. And I'm dying of exposure out here, folks. I'm talking about the Whitney, the Aspen Museum of Art, the New Museum, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Guggenheim, MoMA, PS1, and thousands of other art institutions that have huge endowments and are hugely wealthy art institutions in the United States of America. They are granted nonprofit status for their educational purpose, and they do not allocate any artist fees in their annual budgets. Elsewhere in the world where I've worked, and I've had the honor to work in other countries, institutions pay artist fees without asking a question about it. They pay for your expenses. If an artist, otherwise known as an art worker, a cultural worker, or as Lisa Phillips from the New Museum stated in this week's Time Out, cultural creators. If we're invited to present work in art institutions in the United States, they don't acknowledge the fact that we must make wages to live on. Jack Smith prophetically noted he felt in the United States that the United States itself hates artists. I cannot come to any other conclusion after my experience with the hugely wealthy, hugely endowed U.S. institutions of art, where boards of directors stuff their pockets with the money made off of the artists in their collection by advising to do shows on those artists, where the gobs of money that the collectors spend selling their works to each other is then written off as a fully deductible tax write-off, while artists are only legally allowed in the United States to write off the material costs, the material expenses it costs to make the work. We are not allowed to write off what our works cost in the market when we donate them. And institutions who buy multi-million-dollar properties or make multi-million-dollar renovations have no artist fees, have no audiovisual equipment, and borrow it from nonprofit institutions. Where everyone is squeezed except for the directors, except for the collectors, and except for the real estate developers. Folks, I'm not making this up. This is a travesty. It's an unregulated market where artists, performers, and independent curators are flat out refused to be paid for their work. With the collapse of the NEA in the 80s, these admirable art institutions willfully and have enthusiastically gone along with this game, where no individual artists receive fees. They are actively advocating in their board meetings against paying artist fees, stating that the artist will not and should not receive these fees because we are paid in exposure. And perhaps at some point, this exposure might lead to us hitting the jackpot in the art market. We are therefore forced to become market speculators rather than cultural workers. You've heard this a couple times already. Under duress, we agree, the artists, that all the corporate, private, and public money will be allocated to the museums, its endowment, its staff, and its special events, and none to artist fees. But what about our day-to-day living, which you've heard about? Those artists, performers, and independent curators making valuable cultural work day to day, perhaps the artists who are never collected making this valuable work. For the forever emerging artist, I've been an emerging artist for 13 years or so, I'm pretty sure. I'm here to announce tonight, thanks to Creative Time, that my internship in the art world is over. Artists must realize that the importance of us together refusing to do work without a fee is where we begin. We can choose to donate our work to worthy institutions and our services if we choose to do so. But there should not be one instance where an artist, a performer, or an independent curator is coerced to work, perform, exhibit, or screen their work for free at any U.S. art institution. To all the directors and administrators and curators and staff of these institutions, we shall not be put in a position where we're forced to work solely for exposure's sake. It's unethical, it's illegal. It's illegal to refuse to compensate people for their work, even if it is cultural work. The money in the art world and its market system is being distributed unethically, unevenly, unfairly, and we see that in the disaster of the economy we witness pretty much right now as we speak. This must end now. These circumstances are forced upon us by our peers, unfortunately. Peers who act out of perhaps ignorance or an unquestioning of the prevalent practices in the art world. Or because investors or advisors tell them what they must do at their institutions. Because no one ever directed them to think about these issues. The art market presents the ultimate capitalist fantasy. Let the dreamers, we the artists, make the work. Let us survive solely in the marketplace and not in the labor force. No one can establish ground rules for our defense except for us. As we must breathe and live and eat in this capitalist system, we are asked to work for free. Why is art making a career choice with no living wage? If we do other work, perhaps teach or have second jobs, we are paid for that work. Museum directors, curators, and board members may think it's absurd to pay me $75 for a screening of my video. But I can buy 2 weeks of groceries with that $75. The divide between the rich and the poor is as real as the food on my table. If Target can sponsor the museum's free nights, then why isn't the institution raising funds for artist fees if these expenses are covered by corporations? John Chambers, who was the spurring advocate of CARFAC, the Canadian artist activist group mentioned by my comrade, said that it is absurd to exclude artists from payment for their work and the reproduction of it within an economic climate where it is socially acknowledged that payment is granted for services rendered, as we stated. Our work is services rendered. In the US, artists work without fees. We become secretive, splintered, and disconnected from each other. We compete in a late capitalist endgame so that maybe we can get a scrap of exposure. And perhaps 2 to 5% of us will make it in this huge thing huge scheme known as the art market. Artists at this moment ask nothing of fairness from these institutions so that we do not insult them while they coerce us to work and exhibit our work. They devalue this work by not paying for it, as at the same time they request that it be featured in their institution. And they gain notoriety, exposure, and more cash donations for their coffers as they do these unethical, as they continue to become unethical in these practices. We are being manipulated in a competitive system to do this work for free, so we must become unified and informed about these practices and the scam known as the art market. I want to continue to live here. I want to continue to work here. I should not be squeezed out of here by the very institutions and people that survive off of the fruits of my labor. All workers, including artists, performers, and independent curators, must be paid for their work, and money for our expenses are not artist fees. Museum directors, you must rectify this situation and return to an accountable, fair, and structured economic playing field with the artists that you work with. You must allocate artist fees for all artists with whom you work in all of your annual budgets, no matter if the artist is successful or not in the marketplace. Artists, you must be brave artists and advocate for our trade and opt out of this unethical scheme being forced upon you. Join W.A.G.E now. If it's free, it's not for me.
Okay, I'm just going to end this by reading a short manifesto that we wrote together. And let y'all know that we will have meetings open to the public at Judson Church within the next month. Please send an email to wageforwork@gmail.com or check out our web FOR, WAGE, FORWORK @gmail.com, or check out our website, wageforwork.com. Okay, this is our manifesto. W.A.G.E works to draw attention to economic inequalities that exist in the arts and to resolve them. W.A.G.E has been formed because we, as visual and performance artists and independent curators, provide a workforce. W.A.G.E recognizes the organized irresponsibility of the art market and its supporting institutions and demands an end of the refusal to pay fees for the work we are asked to provide. Preparation, installation, presentation, consultation, exhibition, and reproduction. W.A.G.E refutes the positioning of the artist as a speculator and calls for the remuneration of cultural value in capital value. W.A.G.E believes that the promise of exposure is a liability in a system that denies the value of our labor. As an unpaid labor force within a robust art market from which others profit greatly, W.A.G.E recognizes an inherent exploitation and demands compensation. W.A.G.E calls for an address of the economic inequalities that are prevalent and proactively preventing the art workers' ability to survive within the greater economy. We demand payment for making the world more interesting.